The morning Celeste Beaumont walked into the Hargrove County Community Center and set her briefcase on the folding table. You could have heard a pine needle fall on packed dirt. 43 people sat in metal chairs under ceiling fans that barely moved the August air, and every one of them knew what she had and what they needed, and every one of them was waiting to see what she would do with that knowledge. Dale Whitmore, who ran the county's largest document digitization operation and had been pressing her for 14 months to sell, sat in the front row with his hands laced together and an expression of patient confidence that had not yet learned what it was about to learn. Outside, the temperature was 104 degrees for the 16th consecutive day. The county's Central Records Archive had flooded in March, and then in May, the backup facility had burned, and now every government office, every attorney, every title company, and every small business in Hargrove County was operating in a fog of missing history, unable to prove ownership, unable to close loans, unable to settle estates, because the paper memory of the place had been destroyed twice in the same calendar year by water and then by fire. Celeste was 38 years old and had been in Hargrove County for 19 months. She had arrived with 2 boxes of her own possessions and keys to a storage facility her father had rented and paid on without interruption for 19 years, and nobody in that room had thought she was anything other than a quiet woman starting over with nothing to recommend her. The real verdict, though, had been delivered not in that community center and not in any of the offices where Dale Whitmore had made his offers. It had been delivered in a 10 by 20-foot climate-controlled storage unit on Old Briar Road in the dark among thousands of archival boxes, long before any of them knew they would one day need what was inside. She had arrived in Hargrove County on a Tuesday in January, 19 months earlier. Driving a rented cargo van, she had loaded herself because there had been no one to help her load it. The divorce had been final for 11 days. Her ex-husband, Marcus, had kept the house, the investment accounts, the 2 vehicles, and the gallery they had built together over a decade, because the gallery had been incorporated in his name alone during a year when she had trusted him without reading carefully enough what she was signing. Her attorney had told her she had been cooperative to the point of injury, which was the kindest way the woman could find to say that Celeste had believed in a person who had long since stopped deserving it. Celeste had walked away with the cash value of her retirement account, which after penalties and taxes came to $41,218, and a key her father had mailed to her 6 weeks before his death, with a note in his careful handwriting that said only, Unit 14, Briar Road Self-Storage, Old Briar Road, Hargrove. Paid through the year. Everything inside is yours. She had not known about the storage unit. Her father had never mentioned it in any conversation she could remember. He had been a methodical and private man who had run a one-man records management consultancy for 31 years, and he had apparently rented that unit 22 years before she arrived, 3 years before her marriage, and had paid the monthly fee every single month without ever telling her why. She had driven to Old Briar Road before she rented an apartment, before she bought groceries, before she did anything else, because the key was the only thing that felt like direction in a life that had just been emptied. The storage facility was run by a woman named Mrs. Okafor, who was in her late 70s, moved slowly, and had a voice like someone reading from a document she had already read 1,000 times and still found worth reading. Mrs. Okafor told her the unit had been paid in full every month for 19 years by Gerald Beaumont, and that Gerald had also paid for the climate control upgrade when the facility installed it 12 years ago, and had never once come to inspect the unit in the 4 years Mrs. Okafor had managed the place. She didn't know how often he had come before that. Celeste had opened the unit and stood in the doorway for a long time. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, the unit held archival boxes in labeled rows, and a filing cabinet, and a flatbed cart, and a dehumidifier plugged into the unit's single outlet, running softly. The boxes were labeled in her father's handwriting in a system that took her nearly a week to decode: county name, document type, date range, source, Hargrove County, deed records, survey plats, probate filings, tax assessments, court records, business incorporation documents, water rights filings, zoning variance records, going back in some cases to the 1880s. Gerald Beaumont had spent the latter portion of his professional life quietly acquiring, scanning, and archiving the original and duplicate records of Hargrove County from courthouses, from estate sales, from retiring clerks, from old law offices being dissolved, from church basements, from the attics of families who did not know what they had. He had done it because he believed records were the connective tissue of a community, and because he had watched floods and fires take them before, and he knew no one in any official capacity was doing it reliably. He had never told anyone. He had simply done it, month after month, year after year, and then he had died and left the key to his daughter, who was the only person in the world who now knew what was in that room. Celeste had sat down on the concrete floor outside Unit 14 and done what she later described to Mrs. Okafor as the accounting. $41,218, first, last, and deposit on a furnished apartment, $2,400. A second-hand car, $6,500. Food and utilities for 6 months at roughly $1,200 a month, $7,200. That left $25,118 and no income, and no job, and no connections in Hargrove County, and a storage unit full of paper records that belonged, in a legal and moral sense she had not yet fully worked out, to the community that had generated them. She was starting over from a deficit she had not created, in a place she did not know, with an inheritance whose value she could not yet name. What she had instead of capital was the habit of careful work, which her father had given her, and a quality that people in Hargrove County would spend the next several months mistaking for passivity. It was not passivity. It was patience, which is a different thing, and the difference would eventually matter to everyone in that room at the community center. She rented a small office above the hardware store on Main Street 3 weeks after arriving, and put a plain sign in the window, Beaumont Records Research. She registered the business and set up an inventory database, and began the slow work of cataloging what her father had left her, cross-referencing his system with county records so she could understand what she had and what it corresponded to. The town noticed her the way a town notices something it has already decided to discount. She was a woman alone, in her late 30s, no husband, no children mentioned, no history in the county, renting a small office above a hardware store, and going to the storage unit on Old Briar Road every morning in a second-hand Honda. The hardware store owner, a man named Phil Decker, who had a gift for certainty about things he knew nothing about, told the barber that she was probably one of those women who thought she could make a living poking around in old papers, because she had seen too many television programs about genealogy. The barber told the diner. The diner told the rest of the town. By February she had been categorized, and the category was harmless and probably bound to fail. Dale Whitmore introduced himself in March. He was 51, impeccably dressed in a way that felt slightly off for the county, as though his clothes were communicating membership in somewhere else. He ran Whitmore Document Solutions and had contracts with 11 counties in the state to digitize and manage public records, and he had his eye on Hargrove County as the 12th. He knew there was a records gap, a problem with preservation and accessibility, and he was building a case for a county contract. He bought her a coffee at the diner and told her he admired her initiative and that he imagined it was hard going, being new in town, working alone in a small office, trying to build something from scratch. He asked, with the tone of a man offering a favor, whether she had considered selling her inventory to a larger operation that could really do justice to the material. She told him thank you for the coffee and that the material was not for sale. He smiled and said, of course, just an idea, no pressure at all," and left a business card she put in her desk drawer without looking at again that day. The cataloging took 4 months. It was painstaking and often tedious and occasionally astonishing. She worked 6 days a week, mornings at the storage unit and afternoons at the office, and she developed a system of redundant digital backups because her father's lesson was not lost on her. She stored copies in 3 separate cloud accounts and on 2 external drives kept in different locations, and she printed a master index and kept it at the apartment. She was spending down her reserves at a controlled rate, and by late spring she had pulled in enough from small genealogy requests and title research jobs to cover her basic expenses, which meant the clock had slowed but not stopped. The work itself was sustaining in a way that was hard to articulate to anyone who had not been broken open by a loss and found unexpectedly that there was still something they were genuinely good at. She could read her father's system now as naturally as reading a sentence, and what the records told her, collectively, was a history of the county in its own handwriting, full of disputes and transfers and families, and the slow geography of human settlement on a particular piece of ground. She had come to think of the collection as a kind of conversation the land had been having with the people on it, and she was the first person in a long time who was quiet enough to hear it. Her neighbor in the office building was a woman named Miriam Voss, who was 74 and had emigrated from Eastern Germany 41 years ago and now ran a small tax preparation service. Miriam was the first person in Hargrove County who did not look at Celeste with an expression that contained any element of pity. In late April, she brought a tin of cookies to the office and sat in Celeste's client chair and looked at the rows of boxes visible in the opened storage unit on her phone screen and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in her measured, slightly formal English, "The land does not lose what it knows. People lose it. The land keeps the account. It only speaks softly, so you must come close and be still to hear it." Celeste had asked her what she meant, and Miriam had said, "Your father came close and was still for 30 years. Now you are close. Now you are still. You have everything he gathered. The question is not whether it has value. The question is whether you will be patient enough to be here when the county needs to hear what the land remembers." She ate a cookie and went back to her office and left Celeste with a thought that arranged itself into a sentence she wrote on a note card and taped above her desk. "The land keeps the account. Be still. Come close. Be here." It was Miriam who told her in May about the flood at the county records office. The March flood had destroyed the ground floor archive, which held deed records, survey plats, and tax records going back to the 1940s. Celeste already knew this from the local paper, but what she had not known, and what Miriam told her, with the gravity of someone who had seen administrative catastrophes before, was that the backup microfilm copies were stored in the basement of the county annex on Sutter Street, and the basement of the county annex on Sutter Street had flooded at exactly the same time, because the county had been using a single drainage system and the system had failed at its single point of failure. So the primary records were gone and the backup was gone, and the county was now operating for a swath of its history, entirely from memory and from whatever private copies individuals happened to hold. Celeste went back to her inventory database and searched. She had, in her father's collection, deed records and survey plats and tax assessments for Hargrove County going back to 1887. She had probate filings from 1901 forward. She had water rights documentation from the original homestead era. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days, and then she did something that Miriam later said was the shrewdest thing she had ever seen a person do in a moment of advantage. She did nothing visible. She kept her door closed and her sign small, and she continued taking small genealogy jobs, and she let the county go on, not knowing what she had. She was not being cruel. She was being her father's daughter, which meant she was doing the arithmetic. She had $41,218 at the start. She had spent to that point approximately $22,000. She had earned back roughly $9,000 from research fees. That left a working balance of about $28,000 and an archive whose value was climbing by the week as the county's records crisis deepened. If she surfaced too early, with no leverage and no demonstrated track record of professional service, Dale Whitmore or someone like him would find a way to absorb what she had at a price that served him. She needed a validator. She needed someone from outside the county to assign a number to what she held before she brought it to the county's attention. And she needed that number to be publicly known. She had, in other words, banked a coal under the ash, and she was feeding it air only slowly, watching it brighten, waiting for the moment when it would be a fire rather than an ember. The validator arrived in June in the form of a man named Thomas Eklund, who was a title attorney from the state capitol working on a land dispute involving 312 acres of farmland in the northern end of Hargrove County. The dispute had been stalled for 8 months because the original deed transfer from 1923 had been in the destroyed archive, and no copy was thought to exist. A paralegal in Eklund's office had found Beaumont Records research through a genealogy forum and sent an email with low expectations. Celeste had the deed. She had the original survey plat and the 1923 tax assessment and the probate record from the related estate. She provided Eklund with certified digital copies within 48 hours. Eklund called her and asked how much she charged. She told him her standard research fee, which was $125 an hour plus a document retrieval fee, and the total came to $410. Eklund went silent for a moment and then said, "Ms. Beaumont, I have spent 8 months and approximately $14,000 trying to find documentation that you located in 2 hours." She told him she was glad to have been useful. He asked whether she had other Hargrove County holdings of similar depth, and she said she had comprehensive holdings back to 1887. He asked whether she had considered the county contract. She told him she had not been approached about a county contract. He told her she should be, and that if she wanted a letter from his firm attesting to the professional quality of her archive and her retrieval service, he would provide one without charge and without prompting, because it was simply true. She cashed Eklund's check and wrote the number in the margin of her budget sheet, next to a note, "Outside Validator, June." Then she called the county clerk's office and introduced herself and offered to meet and discuss what she held. The county clerk, a cautious woman named Sandra Holt, came to the storage unit 2 days later and walked the rows of boxes with a flashlight and an expression that moved slowly from skepticism through astonishment to something close to agitation. Because she had been the one responsible for the backup microfilm, and she had not known those backups were gone until 6 weeks after the flood, and she had spent every day since trying to find a solution. What Celeste had was not a solution. It was the solution. It was the only comprehensive surviving record of Hargrove County's history back to the 19th century. And it was sitting in a 10 by 20 foot climate-controlled unit on Old Briar Road, maintained on a dehumidifier and paid for, month after month, by a man who had been dead for 22 months and had never once asked for anything in return. Sandra Holt had barely finished her tour of the storage unit when Dale Whitmore appeared at Celeste's office door the following Monday. He was less warmly dressed this time, and the patient confidence was still present, but had acquired a slight rigidity, like something trying to hold a shape against pressure. He said he had heard, through official channels, naturally, that there was a possible archival resource that might be relevant to the county's records situation, and he wanted to discuss a partnership. He said partnership, but his briefcase contained documents for an acquisition. He placed a number on the table, $80,000 for a full transfer of the archive and the associated intellectual property. He described the offer as generous, given the uncertain legal status of materials acquired through private channels over many years, and he described Celeste's situation as precarious, given that she was, after all, a one-person operation with no institutional backing. She noticed that he knew the archive went back to 1887. She had not told him that. She had told Sandra Holt that, 2 days earlier, in a private meeting. She thanked him for the offer and declined it. He said he hoped she would think carefully about her position, given that the county might be obligated to consider legal questions about private possession of what could be construed as public records. She said she had a letter from a state-level title attorney attesting to the archive's status as a privately assembled collection of legitimately acquired documents, and that her father had documentation of every acquisition source, which she had reviewed and organized, and that she looked forward to continuing the conversation with the county clerk's office. He left, and she called Miriam on the phone and said, "He knew the date range. I didn't tell him." Miriam said, "Then he has been very attentive." Celeste said, "Yes, and now I know exactly what his attention is worth." Dale Whitmore made 2 more approaches over the following 3 months, each time with a larger number and a new category of implied pressure. The second time he arrived with a letter from a county commissioner suggesting that the county might need to exercise its archival preservation authority over materials of public significance, which was a legal argument so thin it would not have held a sheet of paper against a mild wind, but which was designed to frighten rather than to win. Celeste forwarded the letter to Thomas Eklund's firm and received a response within 24 hours, clarifying that no such authority existed under state law as applied to privately assembled collections, and that the county's path to accessing her materials was a contract negotiation, not a compulsory exercise. She filed that response and said nothing publicly. The third time Whitmore came, he offered $200,000 and told her, with the warmth entirely gone from his voice, that he was prepared to make things difficult for her if she continued to position herself as an obstacle. She told him that she was not an obstacle. She was a records professional doing her work. She told him she hoped he found the day productive and showed him the door. It was August when the crisis arrived with the force of an open furnace door. The drought had been building since June, but the 15th of August was the day it stopped being an inconvenience and became a catastrophe. Every well drilled shallower than 400 feet in Hargrove County went dry in a 3-week span. Crops failed. Livestock operations consolidated or surrendered. The county's water authority announced emergency allocation protocols. And in the chaos of the water crisis, something else happened that nobody had foreseen. The wave of emergency loan applications, property liens, insurance claims, and water rights disputes that flooded the county courthouse required documentation that the courthouse no longer had, because the courthouse records had been destroyed in March and May. Without historical deed records and water rights filings, the county could not adjudicate who held prior appropriation rights to the diminished water supply. Without probate records, estates could not be settled to clear titles for emergency financing. Without tax assessments, insurance adjusters could not establish baseline values. The records crisis, which had been a background inconvenience for 5 months, became an acute emergency in a single August week, and everyone in Hargrove County suddenly needed what was in Unit 14 on Old Briar Road. Phil Decker came first. He was not the person she had expected, but he was the right person for the story. Because Phil Decker had been the one who told the barber who told the diner. And Phil Decker had said, "Woman alone," out loud in the diner in November, with a particular inflection that carried the full weight of a dismissal. His farm operation used a well drilled in 1987, which meant it was dry. His crop insurance claim required a tax assessment record to establish land value, and his insurance adjuster had been unable to obtain one from the county office because the county office did not have it. He came to her office on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of August, and he stood in the doorway and did not come in right away. And when he did come in, he looked at the floor and said he had heard she might have some of the old county records, and he needed a 1987 tax assessment for his parcel and anything she had on a water rights filing his grandfather had made in 1948. He had his hat in his hands. She did not make him stand there long. She told him to sit down, and she opened her database. She had both documents. She printed certified copies and charged him her standard retrieval fee, which came to $200. And she told him that if he knew others who needed similar research, she was available, and her rates were posted on her website. He thanked her and said, not looking up, "I told some people some things about you when you first came here that weren't fair to say." She told him she appreciated him saying so. He put on his hat and walked out, and by that evening she had 7 additional requests waiting in her inbox, and by the end of the week the number was 41. Miriam came to see her on a Friday evening that week after the last client had gone, and sat in the client chair and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The land kept the account. You were still enough to hear it." Celeste told her that her father had done the real work. Miriam said, "He started the account. You understood what it was worth and you held it steady. That is its own kind of labor." She left the cookies on the desk and went back to her office, and Celeste sat with the note card above her desk for a long time, reading it, thinking about the kind of patience that looks like doing nothing but is actually doing everything, and thinking about her father, who had paid 480 months of storage fees to leave his daughter something that could not be stolen in a divorce because it had never been in anyone's name but hers. The community center meeting was called by the county commissioner on the 22nd of August. The stated purpose was to address the records crisis and explore options for emergency records reconstruction. Dale Whitmore had requested a place on the agenda, and he had circulated among county officials a proposal for an emergency county contract with Whitmore Document Solutions that would give his company exclusive digitization rights to the Beaumont Archive in exchange for a one-time licensing fee he had set at $60,000 to be paid to Celeste, with Whitmore retaining all ongoing access fees and resale rights for a 20-year period. The proposal had been shared with at least 2 commissioners before Celeste saw it, which meant it had been circulating in channels she was not part of, which meant Whitmore had been working the room for days. She had read it the night before the meeting and had done the arithmetic. $60,000 up front. Whitmore retaining access fees at the rates he proposed for 20 years. At current demand levels, conservatively projected, his share over 20 years came to between $2 and $3 million. He was offering her 3 cents on the dollar, framed as a fair licensing arrangement, and he had been building support for it among people who were too desperate to read the numbers carefully. She had come to the meeting with 1 page of notes and the briefcase her father had used in his business, which she had found in the storage unit and cleaned and used every day since because it held things steady and felt like an instruction. She set it on the folding table, and she looked at the 43 people in the metal chairs, and she thought about the arithmetic one more time, and she knew what she was going to do, and she knew that it was not what Dale Whitmore was expecting, and not what the room was expecting, and probably not what anyone had thought a woman alone would do when she finally held the power. She told them she was not going to accept the Whitmore proposal. She told them she knew it had been circulating before this meeting, and she knew the number he had put on the page, and she had done the arithmetic. And the arithmetic said the proposal was designed to extract from the community's own historical record a profit that belonged to the community. She told them she had something to say about how she knew the proposal had been circulating. In his written proposal, Whitmore had described the archive as containing comprehensive deed records and water rights filings covering 411 individual parcels with historical documentation back to 1887. She had never given him that number, 411 parcels. She had not told Sandra Holt that number. She had not told the county commissioner that number. That number came from the inventory database, and the inventory database was on her computer in her office, and she had not shared it with Dale Whitmore, which meant Dale Whitmore had found it without being invited to look. She watched him in the front row, and she saw the moment the room understood what she had just said. He said the number had been estimated from public information. She said the number was not estimable from public information. It was a specific figure from a private database, and she had noted it in her records because it was a number she had entered herself and would recognize. He said her accusation was serious. She said it was an observation, not an accusation, and that he was welcome to explain where the figure came from. He did not explain. The room was very quiet, and the ceiling fans barely moved the August air. Sandra Holt from the second row said, "Where did the number come from, Dale?" And Dale Whitmore, who was a man of smooth certainty and careful presentation, had no answer that would serve him. And the room understood that in the way a room understands something all at once, like a tide going out. Celeste told them what she proposed instead. She would provide the county with a professional records access agreement at a flat annual fee of $12,000 per year, which was the number she had worked out covered her operating costs for the archive, including the storage unit rental, the climate control, the insurance, the database maintenance, and her time at a rate that was not extravagant. The county would have full research access. She would hire and train 2 research assistants, which she had already identified as positions that could be filled by people in the county who needed work. All digitization would be done in partnership with the county clerk's office, with the resulting digital archive jointly held, with backup protocols that her father would have approved of. Anyone in the county with a legitimate records need during the current crisis period would receive their first 2 document retrievals at no charge, which she could afford because she was not trying to make a fortune from the worst season the county had had in a generation. She was trying to do what her father had been doing for 31 years, which was hold the memory of the place steady until the place needed it. She told them one more thing. She told them her father had been a records manager from a county 3 states away, who had never lived in Hargrove County and had never asked Hargrove County for anything. He had spent his professional life quietly gathering what the county was losing and keeping it safe, because he believed it belonged to the people who had made it, and he had paid $480 monthly storage fees across 19 years to ensure that it survived him, and when he died, he left it to his daughter with a note that said, "Everything inside is yours," and she understood that to mean that the responsibility was hers now, which is a different thing from the profit being hers. The land keeps the account. She had been still enough to hear it. She intended to stay still and keep hearing it for as long as the county needed her to. Dale Whitmore left before the vote. He walked out through the side door of the community center, and no one called after him, and no one followed. And the county commissioner later said to the local paper that his proposal had been reviewed and found to be inconsistent with the county's interests, which was a bureaucratic sentence that meant, "We saw what he was doing, and we chose decency instead." The vote for Celeste's proposal was unanimous. Phil Decker moved it, and Sandra Holt seconded it, and the commissioner signed the preliminary agreement that same evening, which was a Friday in August, and the temperature outside was still 104 degrees, but by the following Thursday it had dropped to 82, and the week after that there was rain, 2.5 inches over 3 days, which was not enough to end the drought, but was enough to change its character from catastrophe to hardship, and hardship was something Hargrove County knew how to manage. The 2 research assistants she hired were a woman named Carol Fitch, who had worked the county clerk's office for 11 years before a staffing cut and knew the filing conventions cold, and a young man named Raymond Osei, who was 24 and had been helping her at the storage unit voluntarily since June. Raymond was Miriam Voss's great-nephew, which Celeste had not known when he first appeared at the storage unit with a question about his family's land title, and stayed to help because the work made sense to him in a way he couldn't explain and didn't need to. He was the one who had been naming the boxes in his head, she discovered, assigning them small identities based on the families and disputes they contained, and when she offered him the job, he accepted without negotiating, and showed up the next morning with a notebook full of observations about the collection's organizational logic that she had not yet articulated to herself but recognized immediately as correct. Miriam came to the office in October, when the drought had officially broken and the county was beginning the long work of reassembling what the year had taken from it. She brought the tin again and sat in the client chair and looked at the two desks Carol and Raymond were working at and the rows of labeled boxes visible through the open door of the storage unit on the screen, now fully cataloged and cross-referenced and backed up in 5 separate locations. And she was quiet for a moment, in the way she was always quiet before she said something worth keeping. Then she said, "Your father understood that to hold a thing safe is not the same as to own it. He held it safe for the county. Now you hold it safe for the county." In the old country, we had a word for this kind of work, but the closest English is stewardship. She said the word slowly, in 2 parts, and let it sit in the room. Celeste told her she thought her father would have liked the word. Miriam told her she thought he had known it his whole life and had simply been living it quietly in his way, on this particular piece of ground, paying 480 months of rent for the privilege of being useful to people who did not yet know they would need him. The storage unit stayed on Old Briar Road. Mrs. Okafor, who was now 79 and moved even more slowly than before, told Celeste the first time she came in after the county contract was signed that she was glad Gerald's things had found their right use. She said she had always known there was something important in that unit because of the way Gerald talked about it on the phone when he called to pay the bill, which he had done every month by phone rather than by mail, and in those calls he had never described what was in the unit, but he had always asked after the condition of the climate control and the dehumidifier and the structural integrity of the walls, because he was maintaining something that mattered, and he knew the difference between a thing that mattered and a thing that merely cost money. Celeste asked her what he had sounded like on the phone in those calls. Mrs. Okafor said, "Careful, steady, like a man who was at peace with the work he was doing, even if nobody knew he was doing it. Like a man who had done the arithmetic and found that it came out right in the long run, if you were patient enough to wait for the long run." Celeste thought about that for a long time after she left Old Briar Road that afternoon. She thought about the arithmetic her father had run, which was not the arithmetic of profit, but the arithmetic of what endures, what is worth caring for quietly, year after year, with no audience and no reward, because the care itself is the right thing, and the land remembers it, even when the people forget. She was 38 years old, and she was starting over, and she had been called a woman alone by people who meant it as a diminishment. And what she had learned in 19 months in Hargrove County was that alone was the wrong reading of what she had been. She had not been alone. She had been accompanied by her father's 31 years of careful work, and by Miriam's steady refusal to condescend, and by Raymond's quiet competence, and by the archive itself, which was not a collection of old papers, but a record of the county's long effort to know itself and to hold that knowledge somewhere safe against the day it would need to reach back and find it. She was not the woman alone. She was the woman her father had trusted with the account, and the account was in order, and the county, slowly, was coming to understand the difference. The rains returned properly in November. The wells began to recover. The title disputes were settled, one by one, from the archive. The estate cases moved forward. The insurance adjusters closed their files. The county budget for the following year included the records access contract as a line item under essential services, which was the category reserved for things the county could not function without, and it sat between public health and road maintenance, which was, Celeste thought, exactly where her father would have wanted it. She was not a celebrity in Hargrove County. She was not a beloved figure about whom stories were told in the diner. She was something quieter and more durable than that. She was a fixture. She was a person the county had learned to rely on in the particular way you learned to rely on something that was always there, doing the necessary work, asking only to be allowed to continue. She had arrived with $41,218 and a key and a note in her father's careful handwriting. She had done the arithmetic and found it came out right. The land had kept the account, and she had been still enough to hear it, and she had come close enough to hold it, and that, in the end, was the whole of the story, which had been decided not in any meeting or any vote, but in a 10-by-20-foot room on Old Briar Road, in the dark and the steady hum of a dehumidifier, among thousands of boxes of memory that a careful man had spent his working life gathering so that his daughter would have something to stand on when she had nothing else left.
Vous êtes tous bien plus forts que je ne le pensais. Bien sûr, on est des... je sais pas. Lui, comme boss, il demande 6000 de puissance. Oh, bon, on va avoir le temps de se monter normalement, non? Je sais pas si vous avez le temps de lire, si vous voulez que je vous le lise, vous me le dites. Ils sont l'un pour l'autre. Pourquoi est-ce que Drake ne veut pas écouter Manny? Parce que c'est sa fille, Seigneur Drake. Et coucou, c'est la gazelle, comment tu vas?